Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. So glad you could join me for coffee today. I am a little bit under the weather. I have like a summer cold. So the good news for you guys is I'm going to let Michael do all the talking today so that you don't have to listen to me. But I'm really excited today. This is episode 16, and our guest today is Michael Guckes, and Michael is the senior economist at ConstructConnect. I'm going to go ahead and just bring him in, let him introduce himself, and we're going to jump right into some pretty awesome topics today. But good morning, Michael. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Samantha. Thank you for having me today.
Yes, looking forward to it. Can you go ahead and I think a lot of my listeners who have heard several of our podcasts by now know that I like to have on economists, but you are particularly an economist studying an interesting industry, one that we haven't talked about yet. So can you go ahead and give me a little background and a little bit more information about what it is that you do?
Sure, absolutely. So I've been working in economics in some capacity for over 20 years now. Started with the civil side, working for the state of Ohio, and we looked at a lot of oversized, overweight work, which is, of course, all specialized transportation. Looked at a lot of civil construction. Spent many years doing that. Moved on to manufacturing specifically, and so I was working with a manufacturing consulting group, which was fantastic. And again, there. We looked at all sorts of things, new orders and backlogs, production, supply chains again, and supply chains at the manufacturing level is huge. It's right in the heart of the greater supply chain network,
Absolutely.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So I did that. I was chief economist for 5 years there. Was senior economist there for yet another year, the first year, of course, and then I've been with ConstructConnect since early 2022. So, and ConstructConnect is a little unique. It is non-residential construction focused, but as you know, we'll go through today. I know some things about residential construction economics as well, so it's not going to be purely on the non-residential and civil side, but that's largely my experience over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, and for anyone who's listening, and kind of as I explained to you, and when I reached out to have you on the show, obviously we know that in the freight market world, we really have to understand what's going on with the macro economy, especially industries like manufacturing and construction. So I think that your background is going to lend really well to helping us understand where we're at right now, maybe where we're headed, and some potential implications that might have on the freight market. So that said, why don't maybe you can kind of tee us up here to set the stage, if you will, for we kind of have a feel for where we're at right now when it comes to freight markets. Everybody's predicting some type of a change here in the next 6 to 9 months, really, when it comes to rate. We've seen quite a bit of attrition in our capacity base. So we're kind of expecting some type of a change. But what about in the construction space? Where does that market stand right now? Are there changes expected? Have there been ongoing changes? So can you kind of give us like a little recap of what happened maybe in the last couple of years and where we stand now and kind of your expectations for the near-term future?
Yeah, absolutely. The easiest way to put it is the government put about $8 trillion into the economy in short order, and we've been dealing with the effects of that, both good and bad, ever since, right? So specifically speaking to the construction side, of course, we've seen big growth in civil construction. And one of the things we have to remember is that we're not just building small structures when we think civil. We're thinking, large projects that go many years out, right? From the time that they're first estimated and an architect designs them to the time when it's shovel ready, and then we actually start to break ground. So the interesting thing that we see on the civil side, right, is this tail. It's a tailwind, essentially, that, from what we see at ConstructConnect, we're looking at 7% growth on the civil side through 2024, 2025. And then in 2026 and 2027, it slows down a little bit, and we're predicting 6% and 4% respectively there. The non-residential side, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. We've had a lot of private sector growth,
Right.
Of course, in that. We've seen many small businesses created, just a surge in small businesses since 2020. And that continues to be very strong. And the beautiful thing about business creation is that there's lots of investment, right? And so we have seen growth there, but it's not these strong single digits. We're looking, for example, next year, non-residential growth 3%, and in each of the out years, it's 5%, 4%, 5% again. So it's a little slower.
You're saying like numbers that are their growth numbers, right? 3%, 5%. But
in nominal
how
terms,
is that comparable to maybe years past? Is that kind of to be expected? Is that pretty much just the standard expectation that we should see? Like what's that mean in terms of like health of the construction industry?
Right, absolutely. So, let's put it relative to the bigger economy, right? And the easy thing to say is that, for the country as a whole, right, we're going to target GDP growth of 2 to 3%, right? So if you're above 3%, you're above the average, right? If you're below that, you're obviously looking for more opportunities. The thing that we need to remember, though, within the construction space is, and I'm going to get to this, we jumped the gun a little bit, but the impact of inflation has been huge. And if you go out to my website, I'm sure ConstructConnect, if you go out to a lot of different websites, you can look for real numbers, right? So real numbers are the nominal, the pre-inflation numbers adjusted for inflation. And when you start to look at that, and I'm very much a proponent of stick with the real numbers, especially right now, because inflation is still very much an issue. But we have seen, when you look at real terms, the picture is obviously not as pretty, right? We've seen material prices alone in the construction space have gone up 39, 40% overall since March of 2020, right? That's huge. So in order for you to say that there's real growth in civil or in non-residential, right, you got to remember, if you're looking at it over the last 3.5 years, you got to take off about 40% of that growth.
Yeah, things just got more expensive, not that much more business, right?
Exactly. And so that's a big part of the picture. Now, there's plenty of industries that have seen incredible real growth. Industrial and warehouse, I'm sure your audience has seen, just insatiable demand for steel, for concrete, for a while, wood was huge, right? We just couldn't move enough of it. Mills couldn't produce enough of it. But that also, of course, led to a lot of volatility. And so one of the things that I help our clients and yours as well with is just helping them to think about, how do we make strategic and tactical business decisions this year and next, for example, given all the volatility that we're seeing in the market space, right? The last market that I want to touch on, right, is an important one to this group, and that's the residential side. And residential, it's amazing how strong residential continues to be, right? We continue to see spending growth on the residential side, somewhere in the high single digits to low double digits for the next 4 years. Again, that is not inflation adjusted, but when we look at things like permits and starts, those numbers have sunk a little bit since their peak in the last 2 years, but they continue to be really strong. And hopefully, we'll get through some of this interest rate work that the Fed is doing, right? And that will help make things more affordable again. Your interest rates will come down both for the homeowner and for the owner developer, right? Because interest rates have a direct impact on your return on investment, right? So as an owner developer, whether it's of a warehouse, an industrial site, a strip mall, your own home, we all understand that the laws of cash flow always apply, right? We can't spend more than we ultimately are bringing in. You got to have a positive ROI, and these higher rates are certainly depressing those ROI expectations over the last year. And so we have seen some adjustments there, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah. Well, a couple question. I want to go back real quick when you talked about a lot of the materials where we just, we couldn't seem to get enough of these materials. There was inflationary costs on the materials. Are those costs coming down already, or are they still elevated? And then if they are coming down, what is the supply looking like? Has that stabilized? Is there plenty of materials now? Is there too many materials on hand, but are they still elevated in rates kind of? Like what is the situation right now with all of the raw materials going into these construction projects?
I think you asked about 4 questions there, which is totally fine. You're asking all the right questions.
Then it's like 5.
I know, no, but you're asking all the right questions, so that's great. So when we look at global supply chain pressure, right, that has really started to normalize. You look at pre-COVID levels and levels in the last 3-4 months, 5 months. They've really started to normalize, so that's good. The pressure is off. When we look at the capacity gains that were made in the last 2 years, right? I mean, there was so much investment in supply chains, logistics, warehouses, et cetera, to help alleviate those stresses. And there's fruit that is this being bore from all of those investments, right? So on the supply chain side, I think the pressure's off, and we've seen that too in the rates, right? I'm not an expert on the rates by any means, but I think in general we've seen rates really fall for truckload, less than truckload, TEUs, right, on marine shipments, right? All of those pressures have come off. And that's I think just an example of, or evidence for, sort of that supply chain relief that we've seen. So, what in the world? Sorry about that. My computer went blank there. Got to move the mouse. So the supply chain pressure is off, but I think for this audience, that is also a sign of a need to change tact a little bit and understand that a lot of your customers are probably at the level of inventory they want. A lot of them are also above. When I look at the construction space and we look at the inventory to supply levels of construction materials, we're right around 1.6, 1.7 right now. So you've got 1.7 times as much materials as you do sales, right? It's just a simple ratio when we think about it in layman's terms, right? But when we look back at history, there's really only been one other time when we were this high, and that was for 1 month right before we hit the Great Recession. And so those are the kinds of numbers that I think they make me nervous. I think for this audience, it's not to make you nervous, but to make you realize the conditions are vastly changing, right? We see at the manufacturing level and the wholesale level, these rising levels of inventory to sales. At some point in time, they need to get rid of that stuff. They paid, and here's the real kicker to it, right? Those wholesalers and the manufacturers, if they bought those materials 6 months, a year ago, right, they paid higher prices for them than the spot prices they're paying today. So they've got this high cost inventory that is losing value, and they have too much of it, right?
Right.
What are they going to do? Well, they're not going to keep ordering high levels of inventory. They got to normalize those. And I think that is the thing that for this audience is really one of the most important takeaways, is to be watching.
I think that we've felt levels. That already, right? We've already felt that slowdown, because just when you're speaking about the transportation market and we're talking about trucking volumes, when the housing market hit its peak, and I think that was 21, right? Towards summer of 21, we felt that across the trucking market. It was one of the drivers of all of the volumes that we saw that caused that peak in 2021, because there was so much movement of building materials and construction materials, and even residential. Residential plays a big part too in the movement of non necessarily construction related goods, but so do offices and warehouses, all the racking, the machines, the office furniture that goes into them. If you're going to build a new building, there's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to go into it. So it kind of also has that waterfall effect where we see more products than just the raw materials being transported. And so as we've seen this lull kind of now in recent months of the construction activity, and not even maybe just like the construction activity, I think what you just talked about is the inventory being there and being available means that it's probably already in a position to just easily be moved to a job site and not necessarily need to go on a container, on a rail, on a truck to be brought in for those projects. So working through that inventory that's readily available for those projects does reduce the number of truck movements needed to support the construction industry right now.
And so, the finances of the situation suggest we go back to something that looks more like a just-in-time. I don't know if that's become a dirty word in transportation, because so many people got caught up. When I was in manufacturing, we went through the worst of COVID when I was with manufacturing, and terms like hoarding were commonly used when I was on the speaking circuit and at large events, because they just could not find anything. They couldn't find what they needed. They would call longtime rivals and say, hey, I'll trade you a barrel of X if you have a barrel of Y. And they were all too happy to make trades just to make things work, right? And we got that. I mean, it was an exceptional period of time where we were just trying to save lives, and people were, the manufacturing industry, just like I'm sure transportation was, we were doing everything possible, right, to help people get through that. But the question becomes one of, I hope that we have since shifted out of this sort of hoarding mindset, right? When we have a situation where supply chains are freed up, prices for material goods are now negative year over year, right? We're on our side, in our data, we're seeing price declines of 4 to 6% overall over the last year. So whatever on average, something you bought a year ago, I can get it for you now in the spot market for 6% less, probably more even, just depending on what exactly you're looking at. And so that's a challenge. We need to get back to this idea of just in time, because otherwise you've got too much expensive inventory with carrying cost, right, sitting on your shelves. So the question is for this audience, right, how do we get back to something that's more like that? I'm not saying that it's not the end all be all. We already realized just in time cannot be the end all be all, but we need to come up with something a little more nuanced, right? Something of a hybrid where it's not single supplier. We need to have multiple suppliers. Geopolitics has really started to affect things, right? So
yeah, I was going to say, I think a lot of that strategy of diversification came from, okay, we're not going to be reckless enough to just carry all of this inventory, but where is our inventory coming from? And is that diversified enough to where we have an option to where if we need something in 3 days, we can get it, as opposed to waiting 6 weeks for it to come over the ocean. So I think that there was some maybe more thought that went into the diversification of where is it sourcing from, as opposed to just, we're going to start holding more of it on hand.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's the smarter thing to do, right? I think a lot of the bigger firms I worked with, the smart players really figured that out. They said, our goal is not just to hold all of this extra inventory. Our goal is to come up with 2 or 3 wholesaler suppliers for every material. So that when we get, when a hiccup occurs, right, when something goes wrong with one supplier, the entire, manufacturing line doesn't stop, right? And that continues to be, I think, an important evolution in what we're seeing and continue to see on the supply chain side.
So as we see that, and as we see this work play out, do you think it's maybe safe to say that as we shift away from, all right, let me try to get my thoughts out here. Let's break this down. So during COVID, we totally left the just-in-time thing. We were like, if you can get it in, get it in. And then China played a big role in that, right? Where you would have factories closed for weeks at a time. If they opened for a week, you took as much as you could in the week that they could get product out. So depending on where you were sourcing from and what those situations looked like, people were bringing in just insane amounts of inventory with no real scheduling to it. It was like, I'll take it when I get it. So then you had the port diversification that happened here domestically, right? Where we finally realized we're going to start shifting away from LA Long Beach because of the ILWU contracts, but also just because of the 110 ships that were anchored in LA Long Beach and the weeks that was adding to the supply chain constraints these companies were facing. So we opened up the Southeast, we opened up the East Coast, and we started adding in some bigger players in port diversification, like Houston, Savannah, even Virginia, New York, New Jersey became a lot bigger. So as we were doing this, we saw warehouse capacity maxing quickly at these locations. And I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that stimulated a lot of new construction projects and infrastructure near these ports. But now, as we're shifting back to more of a just-in-time, but something probably in between, we're probably not going to continue to see the elevated levels of inventory, at least coming in as much at a time, needing all this warehousing capacity. So do you think that there will be continued growth in warehousing infrastructure around our ports because there just wasn't enough done yet? Or is that going to slow, maybe even stop for the time being as we start to figure out how are these BCOs going to interact with these ports?
Well, I think most important, I think the one word answer to this is diversification. What we are seeing, the growing bonds between North America and Europe since Russia invaded Ukraine has been a big part of that, right? I mean, we lost Nord Stream. That was huge. Germany runs essentially on cheap Asian oil. They can't do that anymore. They're now building LNG plants. This is astonishing, right? They're building LNG plants at a clip of like 1 every 5 months. And normally they take over a decade to manufacture. So, I mean, what they're doing is game changing. When we think about it from my perspective, when I look at building products manufacturers, when we think of things like steel products, insulation, right, the spun glass that makes your pink insulation, all of those kinds of products, they're very energy intensive, right? And as relationships with major production countries, whether it's energy coming from Russia, some products coming from China, as these trade ties begin to fray a little bit, we see, I think growing opportunities between North America and Europe. A great example that I like to point out is that if you were to take away Russian exports of energy and all of their top products, things like aluminum and various forms of energy, liquid and otherwise. And you looked to a country like Canada, right? It's incredible the kind of similarity in their exports there are, right? Russia's top 12, sorry, hang on. Let me make sure I get it right. Russia's top 10 exports, I believe they all fall within Canada's top 12. So if Canada were to be almost, if they were to go after that loss of export capacity from Russia, you would grow the Canadian economy by 15% right there. So think about it like this. If you spent 3 to 5 years just working to exclude Russian exports from Europe and replace them with Canadian or US exports, that's a huge amount of growth. Huge. I mean, we're looking at I think almost $2 trillion. Not $2 trillion. It's $300 billion. Total size of
there is an
opportunity. Is $2 trillion. That's how I get the 15%.
Is there an opportunity, and in what spaces within like construction related materials for the U.S. to start taking more market share for exports? Because anything produced domestically still requires the raw materials to go in and those to be transported out of those facilities. So what sectors, as far as it may impact domestic and cross-border Canadian and Mexico trucking volumes, might we be looking to see some type of activity increase in?
Well, I think you're on the right track, right? I mean, you're going to have to figure out how do we mine it, right? If you don't grow it, it has to be mined out the ground, right? So we need to look at the resource gathering component to that, right? The manufacturing component, and then the exporting component of those things, and it all involves an evolution, right, in our shipping system, in our logistics networks. I think that's the whole point of this discussion, right? Is to say, where's the economy heading? How is it transforming and evolving? And then how do we, on the logistics side, take that vision of the future and apply our companies in a way that we can, add to that vision and, profit at the same time. That's part of what makes this country so great, is that, doing the right thing helps ourselves and it helps others, right? We're all working together to make things better.
So let me ask you this then. If someone's listening right now, and we probably have an audience of trucking companies, both with assets and asset light, as we call it, which is like brokerages who interact with trucking companies. A lot of specialized providers who heavily rely on construction type projects to drive activity for their specialized equipment. I know you have some background in that. What do you think, given what you're seeing with the current state of the economy, the future state, things that may or may not be happening with the things we just discussed with port diversification, with potential increases in exports, what would be your recommendation to these companies? Because doubtless they're probably still feeling the downturn right now in the construction market. So what's something that they can do to try to kind of mitigate and still even bolster their activity as a participant, instead of just having to abandon ship essentially in the construction space? How do they stay involved and continue to run these companies?
Yeah. So tactically, from my perspective, ConstructConnect has a product called the Expansion Index. This is a really great actionable item for everyone who's listening. You go to our website, ConstructConnect.com, economic resources. It's up in the upper right corner. There's a product we have. It's totally free, called the Expansion Index. And you can see at the MSA level. So that's at like the cities, right? The urbans, like Atlanta, right, would be an MSA. Cleveland would be an MSA. But at the MSA level, we show you in a heat map, right, which areas are seeing more contemplated construction spending than others. And so you'll see entire regions of the country where we have we see and we have strong expectations for where we're going to see that construction growth moving forward. And a lot of it is not particularly surprising. Places where there's greater population growth sees greater construction, right? You see more schools, more hospitals, more strip malls, all that stuff, right? So you look at for example, the Central South segment of the country, basically Arizona across Texas into the Louisiana area, and then up to about Missouri and then back around. So you make that square, that's one region we continue to see strong growth in. Idaho is an interesting place where we see, from a smaller base, but we're seeing strong growth there. And then, for a long time, and it continues to be the case, but we see strong growth through the Ohio Valley, right? Starting with Michigan, coming down through Ohio and into Virginia. So, use our resources if you want to find out where the real activity is occurring in the construction space and where you can probably plug your company in to enjoy some of that growth. It's a free resource. So I strongly recommend you take a look at that.
What about for people who maybe were relying fairly heavily on the residential construction space? What would be your recommendation right now to maybe what would be kind of like a similar pivot, or is there opportunity in a different sector that's growing that might be seeking some additional, capacity options? Because I think that a lot of domestic trucking companies do probably play pretty heavily in the residential space as well. Yeah. So what's kind of where can they find that opportunity to diversify? Is it smart to diversify? Should they plan to always continue that diversification? Is it typical to see residential and non-residential kind of swing more in a tandem than always simultaneously?
Yeah, certainly. The one lesson that I think we all learned during the Great Recession was that diversification was huge. We would see firms that were in only one vertical, and if that vertical crashed, you were done. You had to give up your employees. And once you give up your employees, you can't come back. I mean, I saw that again and again with small and medium-sized manufacturing firms that were not diversified. The owner basically becomes the last person at the firm. And when they start to get new orders, they simply couldn't produce more than what they could single-handedly produce, essentially, them or an extremely limited team. So now you don't have all the people you need. You don't have the lathe guy, the CNC guy. You don't have the minimum viable network of employees, right? And I would imagine that something similar can happen in this industry as well. So diversification is huge for the sake of making sure that you have enough people to regrow and to re-expand your business, when conditions change. So diversification is by far the most important thing. If you're really tied to the housing market, I would say more broadly, so I can rope in multifamily. We have seen more growth we've seen more resilience, I should say, on the multifamily side in the last, year and a half or so. The single family market really has taken a hit with the rise in interest rates. And the other thing too is just, home prices continue to be, for a lot of people, especially the younger families and new families, they're still pretty unaffordable, right? I look at home price to median family income as a ratio, because it gives you a sense of, how many times my annual income, is it going to cost me to buy, a median sized house? And that ratio is really high. I mean, historically high right now. So that's hard. Plus, on top of that, right, we have these rising interest rates. Mortgages are now double what they were 2 years ago. Everyone who owns a home is in a sense kind of locked into it, because if you just were to sell it right, you're probably not going to get the same size house. Certainly for not the same price, not for the same price. So that's the challenge. There's a lot of cost constraints, a lot of pricing that still needs to be worked out of that market. And there's a lot of dynamics to that, right? I mean, we continue to look at one of the major factors of home construction is labor. And labor prices for construction workers is still increasing at over 5%. It's above the rate of inflation right now. Let's just say it's about on par, but still 5% a year growth for just the labor. That is, that's going to continue to support sort of those I would say unhealthy high levels for home prices, pushing it to the multifamily market.
Labor has been so fascinating for me because there's almost no industry right now that is exempt from essentially labor hoarding, because everyone worked so hard to get those employees and recruit and train and have, and there was such a shortage across many industries, trucking included, during these high levels of volumes in the last few years after the recovery from that initial pandemic recession there that we had briefly. But I think that we've seen that in trucking too, and just in a broad economy in general, where compared to we're seeing new job openings fall, right? That's been pretty consistent for a while, but you're not seeing like mass layoffs and unemployment changing drastically. And that's why everyone's confused right now. When we're talking recession, you mentioned the word recession, everyone's looking at labor going, make it make sense, and that's that one sticking point right now. But we hear that too, like in trucking, where trucking companies are scared to let their drivers go, and they're holding on to the equipment and the drivers because they're going to need that. They're going to need that when the market flips. But typically in trucking, the market doesn't flip till enough drivers are tricked to flip that supply and demand imbalance. And so it's like kind of prolonging that higher market by trying to hold out for it. And I could see how in construction, where we talk about some materials, they're still holding expensive inventory. You're still holding expensive skilled workers that took increases and are even still needing to have that higher pay, and you're not letting them go, because that would be pretty devastational for the company if you're going to try to grow, right? But yet there is a decrease in construction activity going on. So I think that's such an interesting little like micro phenomenon, if you will, right now, is trying to balance this labor.
You're so on target, because I think that the paradox is, if do I sell a truck? I mean, do you literally sell capital assets to maintain labor? It's almost like saying, I'd rather have the driver sit, and wait for me to go rent a truck, because, that's exactly what we saw in manufacturing. They gave up labor and then they couldn't get it back. You can't go out to the bank and get a loan for a Kenworth or whatever it is you want to buy. You can go out to the bank and get those a lot more easily than you can go and find a reliable trucker. And so that's the real paradox. And that's one of the things that I've been working with a lot of our clients to understand, is like, you almost have to make wild choices that preserve and protect your labor pool, because once you lose it, once you give it up, you're not going to find it. I wrote this morning, I don't know if you saw it on LinkedIn, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, they had conducted their regular job survey. 92% of small businesses said that they either couldn't find anyone qualified, or they got no responses to their job postings in the latest period. That's phenomenal. I mean, that means there's an 8% success rate of finding someone with minimum qualifications. That needs to be that. Again, I think for this audience, for those who are in the logistics leadership positions out there, right? Figuring out how do you protect labor above all else in this future, right? We could go on and on about the labor force, right? Yeah. But the challenge, the most critical challenge, and I'll keep this very short because I know we're over time already, but the most critical thing about the labor force has been the loss. We saw the percentage of baby boomers and the most skilled, most experienced workers, in other words, we saw a big loss there during COVID. That number, the percentage of baby boomers and experienced workers coming back into the labor force, it never rebounded, right? We saw it rebound for all the younger age groups, but not for the most experienced. And so there's this gap of very experienced people that we're trying to fight through right now. And I think that's why we're seeing so much of the labor picture contrast what everyone else is saying, right? Why is this yet another economist using the R word, recession, when labor rates and the jobs market is just, it's all in favor of the worker, right?
And it's very fair to say, in an industry like construction that does take so many skilled workers, that you might have to hire two to replace one 25-year experienced worker, unfortunately, just because it's a learned skill, and there's a lot of very important skills in the construction space. So just, I guess, labor productivity and effectivity of your workforce is also something that's probably struggled across many industries over the last.
Two quick points. I know we're going over, but one thing is, look broadly for your next worker. Really interesting point. 1 in 8 women are in there's 8 men for every 1 woman in the construction space, right? Yeah. The number of men that have left, it's like down 1.7% over the last year. Women have actually grown by, I think it was almost 5%. So you've offset, to a large degree, a substantial portion of the lost male workforce there in construction with women. So it's really been interesting to see how it's important for leaders to look broadly for all their hires. And so again, that's just one more.
I love that. That's a great. We're going to end on that note, because that's a good one. I hope people are listening. So that's a great idea in general, not just women or men, but are you looking broadly at, are you hiring for a role that necessarily doesn't require 10 years of experience? Or, are there skilled workers who are coming out of trade schools or, college if you're looking in the logistics space and things like that? Like just being a little bit more open-minded to where your talent is coming from and your skilled workers can come from. Yeah, I like that.
Be cognizant of how you ask, where you're asking, right? How are you going to find those people? How are you going to attract a workforce that looks different from the one of 20 years ago, right?
Yeah. Okay, well, Michael, we did have somebody ask if you could repeat for us, and we can drop that in the comments after the show too. But what was the website address that you referenced, and where can they go find the tool that you mentioned?
Right, ConstructConnect.com. So it's all one word, ConstructConnect. You can go from there. There in the corner, there's a resource tab. You can just click on that resource tab. Otherwise, right, just on the LinkedIn or wherever, reach out to me on LinkedIn if you'd like. Again, Michael Guckes. And I would be all too glad to get you any of the resources that I can possibly point you to. And like I said, a lot of our stuff, an amazing amount of our stuff is free. So take advantage of it.
Okay, well, Michael will go ahead and he's going to comment here in the comments so that you guys can find him, connect with him, and make sure that you guys ask him any questions that you have. If you're listening back to this podcast on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube, feel free to reach out to Michael or myself and ask any questions about anything that you heard today, and we'll get you guys an answer. But to everyone who listened today and to everyone who's going to listen in the future, thanks so much for joining us for coffee today.